Today's guest is Amit Jha. Amit Jha works as developer advocate with Amazon Web Services and has 18 plus years of industry experience. In his current role, Amit focuses on identity architecture on AWS, architecting, optimizing AWS environments, and helping customers and partners with cloud adoption. Prior to his current role, he served numerous roles at Microsoft for 11 plus years, helping large enterprises with cloud architecture and development consulting.
Okay, wonderful. Let me share again. Okay, can somebody confirm they can see my deck?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. Wonderful to be participating here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, but I'll just quickly summarize. My name is Amit. I work in New York, but live in New Jersey. I've been with AWS little over 5 years. First 4 years as a solutions architect, and last year I moved into a developer advocate role. So I do bring in good amount of financial services use cases. Okay, super excited to be joining. What do we have today? We will touch upon security foundations. It's very important. And then we go into the topic of the day, which is identity, authentication, authorization, and whole 9 yards of best practices. I have good amount of content, but feel free to interrupt, put questions if you have any questions, because it's important for me to respond to those, then cover my deck. Okay. Security is important. I don't need to stress that. I do want to say that with cloud, before cloud, there's one key differentiation, that ability to move fast and ability to be secure, right? If you take the pre-cloud era, usually if enterprises or customers tended to go towards security more, right? And the nimbleness, the ability to move fast, suffered with cloud. And what was the reason behind that? If you see it, primarily the lack of visibility. That was a key reason, and lack of automation, right? So you don't have visibility of what's changing. You have the afterthought reports, and you didn't have automation in terms of right when the resource is being changed, you can take actions at that moment. With cloud, with automation, you have that change completely. Now it's actually, you can move fast, be nimble, at the same time be secure, right? So I don't have to stress security is job zero. And in at our place, we drop everything if there is a security issue, and focus on that. There is a good amount of detailing in terms of how we secure our data centers. So happy to take those follow-up questions. What is the key best practices? And each area I'll be touching upon key best practices. One, when a customer starts their journey, they'll have an account, right? And then soon they realize that, hey, I may need more accounts. So typically it starts into, hey, I may need a management account. Some places I go, it's like, Amit, I'm thinking in terms of LOBs. So should I put one LOB application into this account, other onto this account? And then there are like SDLC-based accounts. So you have a developer account, integration account, performance-based account, production account. At the high level, there is a production and pre-prod separation. Why are we talking separate accounts? There's a concept called limiting blast radius. Very, very comes like logging. Do you need that centralized logging? Identity, right? Many applications may use the same identity provider. Do you need to have security tools having access to different accounts? Right, so those are some of the thoughts that you will go. Here is an example, not necessarily the only way. There are many ways. This is one of the implementation. As you can see, AWS organization. Here we have a management account. As you can see, we have an AWS organization. Hey, Amit, what is organization? Once you have many number of accounts, you need ability to actually manage them together. And that's where AWS org comes in. Give me an example. There is a concept called service control policy. So you can define, hey, I do not want to have Lambda allowed in child accounts. If you define that, automatically all the child accounts do not have access to that particular. So as you can see, you can have that management convenience. Also billing, cross-charging, there are many other ways. So there's management account, there is log archival, right? Centralized logging gives you a pretty, you can do good amount of observation and monitoring dashboard creation on top of it, right? And here I have a security-based account. On the right is where the workload. So basically the applications or LOBs that are coming in. Some of the users from this account may have access to the workload account. So let's take an example. An InfoSec guy may want to have access to the workload account to do some kind of InfoSec-based tool and getting the reports, right? The key practice here is separate workload using accounts. Uh, Look at your organization structure, map it, and define what could be centralized. Usually, it's the identity, logging, security tools. Sometimes in Fencers, I have also seen compliance. So there is a separate account for compliance workloads. Okay. As it goes, threat modeling is the most important. I mean, just because now you're in cloud, it doesn't mean that the security goes away. It's a shared responsibility model. So you got to have the threat model, identify it, prioritize it, and keep up to date with security threats. With the as you can see, last 3-4 years, we have seen new form factor vectors of attacks, right? So we have to have a threat model updated based on the new security threats and recommendations. Okay, so that was foundations. We got the multi-account design created. We understand that, hey, we may have different set of accounts. We may have users accessing from one account to other. Now we go into the topic that we have today, authentication and authorization. Let's get the basics. Authentication is who, right? Who are you? Are you who are you saying, right? Authorization is basically what can you do? What privileges do you have, right? So those are the at the top level. Now, how do you approach that? Before cloud and after cloud. If you take the before cloud, you pretty much had like enterprises had their own data center, and it was everything within that data center. Whereas when you moved to security in the cloud, the security is at each layer. We call it defense in depth. It's pervasive. Very much each service has their own security layer. Gone are the days that you do at the front and I'm not taking a security at the back end. No, you have to have security at each layer. If you have an n-tier based application, not just at the front layer, but middle tier, other third-party services, data tier, each layer should have their own security implemented. So that's what we call pervasive security, right? If you want to just do a cloud model to security, just from a hardware up to the user, you can very quickly see what all things falls under which area, right? At the top, management has the risk, right? They have to understand the risk of it and then mitigations. InfoSec usually defines the policies and controls, and then there is an implementation that follows. Network security, and then we come into the actual DevSecOps pillar, which is the most important pillar in cloud because your infrastructure can be automated. So CloudFormation, CDK, Terraform, right? Those are creating infrastructures at runtime. So DevSecOps becomes much, much important here, right? So DevSecOps is the key to getting security rightly implemented in the cloud because you are able to create things, like I call it like run instance API as a cloud. Like the day run instance API was created, that's the day cloud was formed. So essentially, you're able to create your compute environment on the fly. So that essentially means your security or your policy should also be dynamic, right? So having the right DevSecOps model is super, super important. What are the top level identity use cases that we see? If I see here, top level, there are two. One is the corporate identity flow, and the second is the consumer identity flow. What do I mean? Take an example. FinServe usually has an employee. An employee has use cases. He joins, so essentially there is an identity event created, right? The employee may move across different teams. His role might change. He may be assigned to a different set of projects. In that case, his privileges are changing, right? And suddenly that employee may find another job and he may leave. So there is an event. So that's a corporate identity flow. The same way, if you take an application like a website or a mobile application, what happens there? You have registration, you have sign in, sign up, and then depending on the website, you may have tiering in terms of what privileges that user can or cannot do. So that's the consumer side of it, right? Understanding that and the services to map is critical. That's first. Second is user point of view. When you say in the cloud, there is one set of user who is creating the environment. We spoke about account, VPCs. Who's actually creating that? It's the operator, right? So that's one flow. That's the user point of view, the operator point of view. You can have an application Maybe there's a nightly job that's waking up in the night and running it. So is there a machine, like a non-human use case? Yeah, bet you can have that, right? And then the end client flow. There are other use cases, and I'm in the interest of time, I won't go into details, but understanding data and permissioning. So when you bring in a data to the cloud, you move the data across different tiers. Each data has permissions. How does the permission also move along with that data, right? That's very, very important. uh, Taking example of FinServe, you may have analysts working on different set of accounts. That's the permission domain. When you are exposing certain data, you got to have that filtration for the analyst, so they should only see the accounts that they are authorized to, right? Similarly, DevSecOps, end-to-end SDLC, who commits, who promotes the code, who runs the security scanning, who does the security code review, how does the code move to production. Each one has different kind of permissions associated with it, right? Custom applications, when you bring in custom application, it has its own authentication and authorization. Fine-grained access, there are many flavors of implementation. Attribute-based access control is one of which we see many different places. So these are top-level identity use cases in the cloud. How do you solve that in AWS? My goal is not to make you expert of these services. My goal is to give you pointers. From here onwards, you can actually do a next level research. So very top, all the services, if you see here, they will somehow will map to AWS Identity and Access Management. So AWS Identity and Access Management is the root. So it has user, group, roles, and all others will have some way linked to it. So it starts with that. You may say, Amit, how do SSO gets implemented, right? There are many applications. I do not want to put in my passwords multiple times. You bet we have a AWS single sign-on. Amit, we have Active Directory on-prem. Can we connect with AWS? Yeah, I mean, we have AWS Directory Service, and there are many flavors of it. Like, do you need domain controller rights? You may actually install Active Directory on EC2. So there are ways in which you can set up integration between your on-prem AD and AWS, or you can directly create Active Directory on AWS and do all kinds of Active Directory-based use cases. So end client, consumer identity, how do you use that? That's where the Amazon Cognito comes in, gives you a serverless user directory, pretty neat, get you up to speed for your website and for mobile applications. All the authentication like registration, sign in, sign up, MFA, forgot password, it's just built in, like few clicks and few lines of code, you are ready to go. AWS organization, we just touched upon, linking set of accounts, right? And then last but not the least is resource access manager. You may actually do set of resources, tagging. I mean, classical use cases, you may have different divisions within an organization, and they may do cross-charging. So they may actually tag the resources based on the cost center that it should allocate, and then you can do a billing based on those tags, right? So IAM, very quickly, it starts with IAM user. You create a user using which you log into the AWS console. You have IAM group, which is basically a management convenience set of users put together, right? And last, the most important in AWS identity is the IAM role. So IAM role is similar to user, but it does not have a long-term credentials associated with it. Key, but it does not have long-term credentials associated with it. So it gets a short-term credential. So here's a typical flow. A user assumes a role. When it assumes a role, it calls a service, STS, a security token service. Think of it like a token vending, and it gives you temporary credentials. And this flow gets used many, many different places. It'll be clear very soon. So in AWS, how do we look at identity and permissioning? You have identity, you define authorization policy, and based on the policy, you may have access, allow or deny, that will tell what a user can do or cannot do on a particular resource. Right? Here is an example of it. Can non-humans assume a role? So when I say non-humans, any compute service, like
Uh,
EC2 is our
Amit,
instance. Yes.
sorry to interrupt you. Your screen is not shared right now.
Oh, okay. Let me do it again. Did it lose it automatically?
Yeah, I think you lost connectivity in between, so it lost.
Okay, can you see it now?
Mm, yes.
Yes, now we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. When did you lose me? Like a
Like,
long back, just now?
Just
just like
long back.
5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Feel free to interrupt if this happens, right? I don't know.
Yeah, that's,
Internet.
yeah.
Okay, cool, wonderful. So here is a policy example, right? Hello. Here in this case, I'm specifying, hey, effect hello action. So you specify DynamoDB and resource. So you can actually specify what are all the list of actions on a particular resource. Is it allowed or denied, right? We talked about non-human access. So basically, a compute service can actually assume a role. So in this case, we are actually creating a new role and saying, hey, EC2, you can assume a role. Hey, Lambda, you can assume a role. So essentially, an application running inside that compute environment will be running under that assumed role context. Last, when you call APIs, you actually pass in the permissioning, because when you're calling an AWS API, there is an authentication and authorization that's happening, right? And we'll see that in detail very soon. So you come to console, you start working with users, roles, policies, right? That's the starting point. But very soon, what happens is customers will say, we do not want to master another source of truth. We do not want to create a user directory somewhere else. We have our own identity provider. I mean, it could be Active Directory, it could be others. So soon we move into what you call a federation model. So you have AWS accounts, you created it. One key thing here is the topic of users, groups, and roles. They live within an account. IAM identities live inside an account. So it's important to understand that, right? When do you use user? Relatively like a small number of users, a need for a long-term credentials. Usually from a best practices, I usually recommend not to use IAM users, because anytime you have a permanent credential, you have to rotate the keys. Whereas if you do, let's say, a directory federation-based setup where you are getting temporary credentials, that's much better from a security point of view. Here you go to create. Now we come to the federation. So typically how it starts, like when an enterprise wants to allow their employees log into AWS, beforehand, the actual, let's take an example of Active Directory, right? Active Directory of the enterprise and AWS have actually shared something called metadata. They have exchanged metadata. So what does it mean? An employee in your organization goes to the portal. I mean, let's take Active Directory. It has ADFS as the intranet portal. Gets authenticated. Once he gets authenticated, it generates something called SAML assertion. Right? It's an XML based. That assertion gets passed to AWS. Remember, they have done metadata exchange. So essentially, AWS understands the SAML that's coming in, and will do a mapping and provide access to the user onto AWS. You may say, okay, all the employees get same level of access? No, you define what is the mapping. So classic approaches are, in your Active Directory, you may have security groups, and you may put, let's say, developers into one security group, testers into one security group, PMs into one security group. And in AWS environment, you may create different roles. So you can do a mapping of security group to roles. So essentially, a developer security group guy, when he comes in AWS, he gets the corresponding IAM role. And you specify the policy for the IAM role. So that defines what all activities, what all actions can that developer do on AWS. So in this case, there is no permanent credential on AWS. Your user store is mastered in your environment, and you're getting temp credentials when you're logging onto AWS. Okay. So ADFS is one approach. There's the single sign-on. It gets implemented via we support external directories. Okta is one. Azure AD is one. See, I mean, this all spans from this ask of nobody wants to manage multiple sources of truth, right? It's very important. Want to have one single source of truth,
Yeah,
and
and
AWS enables that
I would like
via
to
a single sign-on too.
hear me. Yeah, I would like to add here that to
Yes.
our audience. So
Yes.
the concept of single sign-on and the prior screen of the federation, it's
Yes.
nothing but having your organization's current user source of truth, the identities you have, you integrate with AWS. For example, if someone is having a Rainbow Secure identity as a business identity to work with a multi-cloud environment, then the mapping of the businesses Rainbow Secure users with AWS, and then performing the corresponding sign-on onto the entire spectrum of AWS. So this is what it is. So here, same SAML protocol is being deployed for the users to map whether it's an Active Directory source of truth or it's a Rainbow Secure Identity source of truth, and gets mapped with AWS. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that yes, business now have their flexibility in terms of what the source of truth is, but still they can leverage the AWS excellent organization features, and they can have an entire spectrum of AWS resources available to them.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so some customers may want to actually get Active Directory on AWS. I mean, obviously, we provide the choices, right? And we have many different choices. As I said at the start, we have a AWS managed directory service, right? And then some customers want complete control, like domain controller rights. So you could very well install Active Directory on EC2 and manage that way, right? And some customers may actually want to keep the Active Directory on premises, do a network connectivity, and route the AD-based traffic, right? So that's also one of the approaches that we have seen. Obviously, performance-wise, and there is like anything, when I say ELTs have a trade-off, right? I mean, you suffer on latency depending on which architecture you take. But the flexibility of when you're moving a workload to the cloud and having that support, native support for Active Directory, helps you move faster. So the migrations and modernization journey actually gets accelerated. What are the typical type of applications that we see with Active Directory on AWS? You see .NET applications, you see SQL Server, SharePoint, right? These are typically applications front. You also see integration, native integration with Amazon RDS, right? SQL Server, Oracle, those are some of the database engines. And then SSO-based applications for single sign-on needs, obviously. Last but not the least, for your workforce, if you are using Amazon workspaces, WorkDocs, Chime, Workmail, so there's a native integration with Active Directory. So those are many use cases that gets enabled once you set up your Active Directory with AWS. Now coming to non-human access. Again, when I say non-human access, essentially a machine or a compute environment assuming a role, right? Here is a screenshot of when you're creating a role, it tags like, hey, EC2, Lambda, this is the service actually which is going to assume a role. So essentially, the application that's running inside that compute environment will have access to that role. Okay, how do you assign permissions? There is managed policies that you can use, or you can create your own policies, right? Here is an example of it. So very simply, what we have covered so far is IAM, users, roles, group. Since organizations want single source of truth, there may be a SAML federation-based setup, and federation defines how the mapping of your users happens with AWS. Right? Now talk about a developer point of view. Like when a developer comes, he says, I want to call AWS API, right? How do you call? Like how do you authenticate an API call? Very, very important. So let's quickly understand authentication and authorization from a developer point of view, right? Here's a short-term credential. I am calling, in this case, a DynamoDB endpoint, okay? All our services have an endpoint, right? In this case, at the bottom, if you see carefully, there is something called authorization header, right? That authorization header actually has access key. I mean, there is nothing secret about access key. The key thing is the secret key. So we generate a HMAC signature using the secret key, and that's what is attached to as a authorization header. This header, when it's passed onto the server side, which is AWS end, gets validated, and after that, the API call continues, right? So that's a typical developer flow. Okay. Here's an example of assume role. You could actually, as a developer, assume role. Essentially, remember, IAM identities live inside one account. So can an IAM identity from an account assume a role in another account? You bet, they can. And through the APIs, they can do it. They can actually call get session token and create temporary credentials via the STS. Those are some of the use cases for developers. And when they are accessing the resources, at that time, you define actual policy based on which, in this case, if you see, I have given wildcard. I know, I mean, developers left to write wildcards, which may not make, I mean, nobody should be happy with it, not even developers, right? So you go next level where you can specify, hey, only DynamoDB. That's great. You filter to a certain level, but still you're saying, hey, all the resources. Still, I'm not that happy, right? You actually want to go next level. I only want to allow DynamoDB get item and put item. So you're now specifying only two actions, which is great. But resources, you are still saying all resources. So somewhat, so I'm in neutral. But I can go further. And in this case, if you see, I have specified get item, put item, and have specified a specific DynamoDB table. This is what you want, and this is what is the right, what you call principle of least privilege is important. Only give what is needed, and don't go beyond that. Okay, so we give you pretty detailed IAM documentation for the same. Okay, so what all things we touched upon here? We touched upon the multi-account based design. We want to have a centralized identity provider, which can be helpful across different set of accounts. Using a strong sign-in mechanism, it's important. So MFA, there has to be, I mean, gone are the days where you are just as a password. You have to have MFA two-factor kind of implementation, right? And have the audit built in, right? You got to have who's accessing what, continuous monitoring of it. We have a tool called Access Analyzer, which helps you with the same too. Do not use permanent credentials. So IAM users, no. Use temp credentials. So role, yes, right? Obviously, anything that you're storing, you have to have the right secrets. You can use parameter stores or secrets manager for the same. I was talking about the access analyzer. It gives you a pretty neat report in terms of who's accessing what, especially outside of your account. Does it mean that IAM implemented, everything is done? No. So we go back to, again, an application may have, let's take a classic example of 3-tier based application, right? You have a front tier, you have a middle tier, you have a data tier. So front tier may be a web application, right? So in AWS, let's say CloudFront. So CloudFront actually is the first gate where the request is coming in. You could have security at that layer, right? You can enable WAF, web application firewalls, right? So it's important to have security at each layer. You come to the service tier, you may implement it via IAM, right? Authorization. You go to the data tier, you may still implement continuously with the IAM. So, and at the end, if they are in separate VPCs, you can control via ACLs, you can specify like which traffic you want to allow. So it's a defense in depth, which is super important. And on top of it, if you're working on a, let's say, EC2 based environment, you have to have the right level of monitoring, anti-malware, and other softwares also. So defense in depth is the keyword that you want to take home. IAM is at the application tier, but you got to have at each tier, networking tier, right at the gate when you're getting the request, right? Okay. We are just changing gears now. This was primarily, if you can say, operator kind of use cases. Now we go, what about an application that you're hosting on EC2 or Lambda or any of the other AWS compute services, right? How do you do authentication and authorization for that end client who's accessing that application, right? So the end client authentication and authorization. And that's where Amazon Cognito comes in. So Amazon Cognito, right off the bat, gives you a serverless user directory, right? It gives you hosted UI. So from a website point of view, you can integrate with hosted UI. You pretty much get the registration, sign in, sign up, forget password, MFA, just like that. Like within seconds, you'll be ready to go with the same. Not just that, you also can integrate with SAML as well as OIDC-based providers, so OpenID Connect-based providers. So when I say OIDC, you can go social, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, right? You could, any OIDC provider for that matter. SAML, again, it can integrate with Active Directory and any other SAML-based provider. One key thing I want to highlight here, we discussed SAML in the realm of enterprises because that's where we see it more popular. And SAML has been there before even OAuth and OIDC got matured. OAuth and OIDC evolved from this need of between web applications. You wanted to share certain things. And I'll give you this funny story. Like early 2000s, people were actually sharing email passwords with other websites, so the other website can actually do a email lookup. Yeah, I mean that used to happen. So to circumvent that, we move towards token, and that's the OAuth model where you're actually working on JOT tokens, right? And you specify scopes. So when you are sharing some permission, you specify that, hey, I am willing to share these attributes with this particular relying party. So that's the model where you're sharing instead of passwords, it's the tokens, and you specify the scopes under which you're sharing it, right? So that's the web. So single page applications or a web application that calls server-side applications, an OAuth-based implementation, Amazon Cognito supports the same too, right? And when you're talking about web application and mobile application, there are so many frameworks, right? If you're writing client-side JavaScript based, we have JavaScript SDK, we have Amplify, which helps you get going very quick. If you're writing native mobile applications, right, iOS or Android, we have the SDKs for the same. And the beauty is you also have a native integration with API gateway, ALB. What does it mean? It essentially means that if you are writing, let's take an example, single page application, and the single page application calls API gateway as a service tier. The single page application can actually generate the Cognito token, pass that token to API gateway. API gateway, since it has a native integration with Cognito, can validate that token, authorize it, and then let the request flow. Similarly, ALB, which is our L7 load balancer, so layer 7 load balancer, so application tier. So it can actually check the request and look for the Cognito cookie in the call. If it is not, it will redirect, make sure that authentication first gets completed, generates a session cookie, and then it is valid, available for the next set of calls, right? So it's the base level authentication and authorization for web applications and mobile applications. Is that it, or is there more? There is advanced security with Cognito, adaptive auth, compromise. I mean, the typical things that you would expect, like, hey, a user logged in X region and suddenly you see a request for signing from another region. Obviously, the adaptive advanced security feature will be able to capture that, right? So you get serverless directory. There is nothing to manage. You get the users and group storage. It supports SAML, supports OIDC. It gives you hosted UI. It's customizable to certain level. If you're not happy with the customization, it gives you APIs, so you're free to make your own UI and use the APIs directly, right? It supports all the OAuth 2 flows, and it integrates with the SAML as well as other providers. There's one thing that I want to highlight in the Cognito when you talk about authorizations, because it's one thing to know who, but it's very important to understand what. And with Cognito, we are working with tokens, right? You have ability to specify attributes for a user. So let's take myself, right? I mean, what's your height? What's your weight? What's your? There could be many different attributes that a person can have, right? And can you do flows according to the user attributes? You bet you could. In web applications, many of them, they do that. And how do they do it? That attribute information goes into something called ID token. So in the ID token, it has the user information. If it is scopes, it goes into the access token. In Cognito, there's a concept of groups. Again, it's a management-based convenience. You can map groups to roles, right? So that information is also available in access token. So the tokens have the information. When the tokens are being probed, you are able to see those information, and based on that, you can actually do authorization in your applications. Okay. Last but not the least, fine-grained permissioning, and this comes a lot in many enterprise use cases. Take an example. FinServ, I won't name them. They keep 11 million plus attributes. Okay, and there is an authorization that happens before even any call can succeed. So it's basically a call, check what level of work or privilege this user has, and based on that, the permissioning happens. So fine-grained permissioning can be different things for different enterprises. The key is you're going to the, let's take a database, you're going to the rows or column level. You have to have a strategy in terms of how do you map the permissioning with the data, because with cloud there are several services, right? Let you get into S3. From S3 you can move it to Redshift. From Redshift you move to EMR, but permissions also need to be taken care. It's important that once you specify that, hey, this user has only access to this catalog of data, that information should be authorized at each data tier, right? That's where the fine-grained permissioning happens, and there are many different ways to implement it. In SAML world, when you are able to get the federation, SAML assertion, the assertion can have additional attributes. So in Active Directory, maybe the user, an employee, you may have information like which division does he work for, who is his manager, that information can come via the SAML attributes. And that attribute is available as principal tag in IAM. You can write IAM policies checking that attribute, and based on that, allow or deny. Right? I'm just giving you a rudimentary example how you would go about implementing it. You can tag your data. You can have the tags come in via the SAML assertion. You can check if the data tag and the user's tag match, allow his access. If not, don't allow his access. You can be a little creative, name the same so that there is an implicit pass if the names matches, and there is, right? So those are some of the ways in which fine-grained permissioning gets implemented. Okay, so I think I'm at the 44th minute. So few of the identity partners. So there is AWS and then there is partners, right? And partners actually build on top of AWS. We work with many security and identity partners. In the identity realm, some of the known ones are Okta, OneLogin, Auth0, and there are many others, right? So we covered security foundation, we covered authentication and authorization. And the next three I'm going to quickly run through because I think I'm running a little bit behind. So data, it's very, very important. Key guidelines: don't store, don't grant, encrypt, mask, tokenize. It's always important. And many times in data, this thing about, hey, Amit, can I do a pass-through unencrypted? No, no, no. If it is, once you have classified the data, is it PII, is it HVI, you specify the encryption level, you got to make sure that it is always at that, not even in the memory. It's not, nobody should be able to get the memory and get that data. Always encrypt, always, masking, tokenizing, there are different set of tools available to you. Those are very, very important. And many of the AWS services have inbuilt default encryption. Enable them, right? That's important to enable that. Deployed application: when you have web applications, you still cannot get away, like just because you're putting it in the cloud, the top 10 security like SQL injections and other set of it, they still exist. You can enable web application firewall. You can check for those in your application. Those responsibility are, again, security is shared responsibility. So those goes hand in hand, right? So you got to have cross-site scripting and other kind of checks built into your application. CI/CD is another common place where we see the security issues happening, right? Things that gets checked in. I mean, like shared responsibility model. We give you compute, you can bring an application. Now, if the application writes data to Twitter, again, it's a shared responsibility model, right? So there has to be right level of check, be it dependency injection based validation, untrusted code. You download something from GitHub, it's not untrusted. You got to have the right level of checks inside your CI/CD practices, right? And there are many ways. Code analysis, the old school still exists, but there is a way to automate that CI/CD flow. Use tools like Avera Code for security code scanning, and there are many other tools that could be built in as part of your CI/CD pipeline, not to slow them, but to what you call trust but verify kind of thing. And you got to have it at the each layer of your SDLC. We have ton of services. In the interest of time, I'm not gonna go into the details of it. Some of the partners that have worked before in the CI/CD realm, Vera Code, Parasoft, Code Sonar, right? So those are important. Observability tool. Again, once it is deployed, you got to learn how it is being used. Your application is being used. Learn from the access pattern, right? It is very important to continuously monitor CloudTrail logs, CloudWatch logs, X-ray traces, metrics, having a dashboard on top of it to look at what's happening in your infrastructure, in your application, doing that continuous monitoring. Many a times what we are seeing now is organizations are actually learning from their logs, creating newer form factors in your, enriching their applications better. Because I'll give example. Uh, an enterprise looked at their web application and they saw that many users were trying to do a particular workflow and leaving at certain point. They did not get that information via UI click streaming or some other based tooling, analytics tooling, but they got it via their logs because they saw that timeline of those calls and they saw at this point is where the user is dropping off. So there is good amount of value in going through your logs, continuous monitoring from enriching your application, also for NFRs like non-functional requirement. throughput, right? Once you see an issue, essentially you can map it to like what's the throughput expectation, like what's the transaction per second, what you're supporting, how is it scaling, right? So those are very, very important. In spite of everything, you may have issues, right? I mean, we have a quote from our CTO: "Everything fails, right?" And you got to have the right implementation, run book, self-healing architecture. You must have heard the terminologies like microservices, having ability to what you call graceful degradation. So if things fail, it's not like everything fails. You have certain things still continuously running, right? So those are all best practices. You got to have the right set of run books, so you're not running around at the last moment like what do I do at that moment, right? Pre-production, what you can do, like there are ways in which you can actually do game days. You can simulate failures. There is ton of guidelines there, chaos monkey, and other kind of approaches that people have done. But having that run book is super important. An automated way is super important. It's hard, and I think every event should be looked upon from a learning point of view. How you resolve that event would give input to what needs to be automated. Okay, so that is my end-to-end. I mean, I'll share this deck so that you can actually go into details of it. The key things that we touched upon is IAM and Cognito. We also touched upon best practices for data, SDLC, and there are other identity-specific services. Hopefully, this gives you a run-through of how you approach identity in AWS for your workloads, for your AWS journey, like onboarding and end-to-end. Okay, thank you. I'll open up for questions now.
Yeah, Amit, very, very wonderful, very thorough presentation, especially that the way you described, what different forms of identities, are available, whether you are talking about the business apps or the customer side of it, consumer side of it, and the integration touch points that especially the federation and the SAML, and finally the authorization part of it. It was really helpful, and I think many developers who are either attending today or who are going to watch on demand this video, they're going to get considerable food for thought of, and also I like that the examples that you gave in between. In one of the comments I saw that they also like that, the examples that you put in your presentation are really, like give you a bird eye view of what AWS Cognito is. So this is, I think, wonderful. On behalf of audience, I would like to ask a question about if somebody wants to say have a working environment, or say they want to before they go to prod, if a developer wants to have their sandbox environment to test out the identity integration, what options they have with AWS?
Yeah, so sandboxing is very, very important, right? Especially simulating. I want to touch upon one thing that I see many often. Like with cloud, you're able to scale, but the performance testing does not go away. You got to have the performance testing in your pre-pod environment, so you can check the be it Elastic Load Balancer or Application Load Balancer, right? It's scaling properly, because you can write code that may actually break that scaling, right? So how you have implemented it. Now, coming to different environments and identity, there is a approach of, let's say we talked about federation, right? A user can have access to different set of accounts. So let's take, for example, you have a pre-prod and you have production. What's the best practices? I am not into one side or other side. Developers getting access to production, most of the enterprises do not give access to developers into production. That's what I have seen. Is that a best practices? No, I have seen enterprises who actually have, I'll give you commit, check-in, build, test, deploy, notification, end-to-end automated without any gating. And I see many, it also varies by the reputation risk. So if it is a FinServ, they may have a gate at the end because they just need to make sure. I mean, there's an element of like, I just want to make sure all the parameters are right before I push this, because the repercussions of failure are significantly higher. Whereas if I take a new startup, which may not have that level of revenue loss or reputation loss, there I see that they have end-to-end completely automated. So there's no gate. It's basically a check-in or a commit by a developer, does the whole thing, whole 9 yards, deploys it to production, and notifies that it's available. In that case, there might be a failure. If in case, it may not be that impact. Which one is good? It's always depends, right? What
Yeah.
is important is you define your threat model. You define what is the right access pattern for your organization, right? If there are DevSecOps people that needs to have access in production, they have the right IAM role-based access to all the resources that they would need access to. If a developer does not need to access production, he should not be having. So go to the principle of least privilege model, right? That is always the answer.
Yeah.
And based on that principle of least privilege, you will come up with your own list of like what is the level of access each role needs in production versus pre-production. Typically, developers or engineering side does not get access on the production side. It's the DevSecOps guys, which is kind of the bridge liaison between the production and the engineering side.
Yeah.
Again, it differs by organization to
I've
organization.
seen organizations having, that's why they call it dedicated delivery team. Delivery
Yeah,
team is what they work with the change control management. They work with the developer, schedule it. They have the rollback steps just in case they find failures, and try to have a maintenance window if it's like they got in for a business workflow where they can afford to have a downtime, after hours or whatever it is. So I think, yeah, that's the best practice where someone, rather than it should be like, as you mentioned, list privilege or a need-based access. Say, yeah, we can have developers have a some sort of account in the production which get activated only during the maintenance window when they are helping the delivery team to troubleshoot something or do something. But always need to have a backups of the code, backup of your database, the touch point that you're having, and then only work allow to the things to flow through. And obviously
yeah,
people are gonna stay have staging environment, they're gonna have a dev stage, a QA environment. So apart from all those environments, one fact I think, yeah, most of people where they fail, they said, hey, it was working fine in dev environment, right? But dev environment was for limited set of users that they state, limited set of data. They may not have full scale production load. When the same code get executed with production workload, sometimes it fails. So people need to have a equivalent of staging environment with at least a sort of workload, but still do things fail, like the healthcare.gov initially failed when it got launched, or so many different things happened with public website. But essence is that you should be ready for failures. And I like that the runbook idea, everybody need to have a runbook, whether they are deploying in Azure, they are deploying in AWS, any cloud computing you do, the process is same. Whether you are having in good olden days you had a data center, right? With data center, most of the things we were following. Here in cloud also things doesn't change. You have to be ready for your DR. You have to be ready for the failures.
yeah, spot on the whole. I mean, you are saying it much nicely than how I put it. So thank you for sharing that. DevOps being release management, I see there is mixed feelings in the industry. Mostly what I have seen is people are going away from the release team, and primarily there is a DevOps team which is part of the engineering team that's taking the ownership of deployment piece. There can be demarcation, right? And usually when I say DevOps, sometimes it's D capital, sometimes it's O capital, and depending on that in organizations, you see who has the more power and influence, right? So those are some of, see, I mean, in the cloud, the resources you can drop and recreate, right? What I like is whenever a customer says that, hey, I want to have a peace of mind. So I say, like, destroy your region, like destroy everything. Now, are you able to come back in another region? That will tell me like whether the automation has been done correctly or not. Because
Correct.
if your VPC creation or DNS setup and all that is manual, you would know, and you won't have that peace of mind unless you have that end-to-end automated. Like once you have automation, I mean, regardless of how many regions goes down, you could go to Singapore, you could go to any other region and get your application up and running. Again, RPO, RTO, data and size and being able to recover, all that will matter.
Things
But
matter, yeah.
the higher the automation, the better the peace of mind. That's how I see it.
Mhm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
understand that. Yeah, because just like recently, there had been some failures, even in the Microsoft data center, there had been failures elsewhere. But business needs to recognize that when they deploy in the cloud, still there are options where you have to have commit to availing your required level of DR redundancy. You can't say that, hey, I deployed in cloud, but you think, no, he just had his secondary within a same region, or he did not so that's why it's up to the cloud engineers to guide the stakeholders properly, who are managing on the budget side, because there are sometimes you think that a techie person, I know what's the best, but then they may be pushed back from the budget office that, okay, why it's costing so much, can you do something to bring the cost down? So sometimes it does affect the financial aspect of it, the project, apart from the technical. So it's
Yeah,
always.
yeah, obviously. I mean, I touched upon resource access manager, so that's used for financial planning. I mean, I'll tell you this funny story. I joined AWS, and the first job I was given is like, Amit, go reduce this customer bill by half. I'm like, really? Do you want me to reduce the customer bill by half? I mean, right? So I learned along the way, but that is the most important thing, because it's the flywheel, right? If the customer is satisfied, they will actually embrace more, they will use more. It's the important part. And slowly I got that, like, okay, if you work for a real satisfaction and work to reduce customers bill and give them the value, like if their business is getting value, obviously customer would want to leverage things more. And that's the beauty of like this flywheel, right? That's the important part. Even our roadmaps, if you see, 90 to 90% is basically customers giving us a recommendation or asking for a feature that goes into a roadmap, right? So it's primarily not what is cool, what others are doing, or what's the industry buzzword. It's more important what is customer need,
What the
and
customer
focus on
yeah.
that.
Otherwise, things remain in just the developer circles or techie circles, but when it comes to the business, the
Yeah,
business is changing. Yeah,
you got it. I mean, you see the
yeah,
blockchain. I mean, it goes somewhere. Whereas if
yeah,
you see from a customer point of view, because that's the real need, right? A business needs something. That's what you want to serve. I mean, that's the
yeah,
important part. So, I mean, you can be cool. I'm not saying that the research and new tech is not important. It is important. I'll give you example. Like some customers came and said, Amit, Lambda is like the cheapest. I'm like, I will save money a lot. I'm like, no, EC2 can be cheaper. Like, how? So if you have an application which is getting 24 by 7 request, 24 by 7 request, in that case, sometimes EC2, if you take the reserved instances and take the 3-year pricing, right, that might be cheaper than the Lambda calls. So sometimes you have to go into the nuances of things.
yeah,
And just because something is old or legacy doesn't mean it's bad. Like even monolithic to microservices, there are like there is places where monolithic is still perfect. There is no issue with monolithic, right? It's just that the industry is saying, hey, microservice is the new buzzword you ought to implement it. But there are other problems to microservices. Like if you get 1,000 microservices, how do they communicate among each other? How do you do transactions? How do you roll back across these microservices, right? It's always trade-off. You move from one problem set to another problem set. So it's important to get that understanding, I guess.
Also, the automation is very important, that whether you are talking about for the DR sake, for the business continuity sake, because people should understand that setting up what they do, I have seen many times, because I have been working in an enterprise sector for the last 20 years or so, and I have seen in many of the clients, especially, they just totally forget about updating the SQL VIP, because things change, you are changing the resources, but your SQL VIP, although the URL remains same, but behind the scene, all the IP config, all the resources, you have to keep updated. Then only automation will work. Otherwise, it automatically fail, but my users cannot see the data. I'm getting connection errors. You will get, because you have to keep updating your automated script. You have to keep updating your configuration if you are changing the resources, if you are working on something. So I think that's very important, to keep all the things up to date, not just
Yeah.
one thing. Yeah, it is very
Yeah,
much.
yeah. I mean, from a individual point of view, continuous learning is the name of the game now. Like if you see my homepage, it's AWS What's New because I don't know what got launched last night, right? The speed with which we move here, like there is always something being released. It's really hard to be on top of everything, but at least you try to. And continuous learning is the important part because we ourselves learn something, come up with a new service that makes the other one obsolete. But it's important. Like that's how you have to evolve and leverage. So architecture is no longer static; it's continuously evolving for any application.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, I think your presentation overall was very good, and it's going to help us. A couple of interns we have, for they're going to work on clients identity integration and integration of the Rainbow Secure's identity platform with AWS. So much of the things that you will be like a crash course for them, how to integrate with AWS. So we are much.
Actually, hi Amit, that was very nice presentation.
Thank
And
you.
we have one question. Shashi ma'am ask. Can you ask Shashi ma'am?
Yeah, hi Amit. I just want to know what is the role of developer advocate
What is the role of developer
and how
advocate? So
how do
I've
you
been in the role.
become a developer advocate?
Okay, I've been a developer advocate for 1 year, so take that with grain of salt. But I'll give you my experience. Uh, think of developer advocate as a liaison between the product and the developers. So developers comes in many shapes. Right? There are the enterprise developers, there is startup developers, there is new graduates coming out of the colleges, there are enthusiasts and all kinds of things. So as my role is primarily to work with developers, explain them the services, primarily like SDK, evangelizing the APIs, what are the best architecture for solutioning, right? What are the different types of solution for a use case that they're trying to approach? And along that course of discussion, presentations, I learn their needs. So they may find some gaps. So that is what I take in and put in what you call a product feature request internally, work with the engineering team to maybe prioritize, because these are all, each feedback that developers gives, that goes and it does +1 to that particular PFR ask, and that's how the prioritization happens. Once the engineering produces a solution or implementation, I become like understand, look at it, maybe do a videos to explain that concept, and then again bring it back to developers like, hey, we just released this, maybe you want to leverage that. So it's basically go to market from a developer angle, not from a sale angle, right? It's not sales point of view, it's primarily developer satisfaction point of view.
All right.
How do you become one? There is different ways, and there is a different journey. uh, One, you got to have developer experience. That's important. Second, there is an element of what you call solutioning and approaching things like a solutions architect would, right? So whenever we go, we find to first do a discovery, like what is it that you're solving? Let me understand that, right? And understanding that properly, and then mapping it to the services that because we have plethora of offerings, what matches to it, ability to do that consulting based approach, being able to speak at different what you call thought leadership, and then there's good element of content creation. So be it presentations, be it sample solutions, sample applications, all that, blogging. There are many channels these days. So all that, the way in which you can connect with the developers, and that medium keeps changing. These days, Twitter is also becoming one of the biggest medium.
Thank you.
Okay, does that answer your question, or it just muddied it more?
No, it answered my question. Actually, it is what I was thinking.
Okay,
Yeah.
That's good.
cool,
That's
cool.
good. So I
So
think,
Wonderful.
actually, I have one question.
okay, go ahead,
Uh-huh.
Manish.
Okay. So if some startup wants to work with AWS or become a partner, how can they do it?
If some startup wants to, okay, so we have several programs,
Mhm,
and there is also a partner team
mhm,
that we have. I will be happy to connect you, and there is also programs to actually help the startups
mhm.
also. So I'll be happy to connect you with the right rep. I don't know the criterias. I don't
Okay.
know the process, so I would
Because
be speaking
Yeah.
out of my
have
role.
some,
But I can do the connection, and from there you can clarify
because
like how it works.
we have some founders group
Uh,
where
uh,
they are like to work. Currently, they are working with Microsoft, and
uh-huh.
they list their product in Microsoft App Source and App Gallery. But if they want to do it same thing with AWS, how they can do it? That's my question.
So
If you just share some resource, or if you are able to connect with that people, that would be a very great and very helpful.
Yeah.
yeah,
I think I'll connect you with the right team,
Mm-hmm.
and then from there, because the process might also change, so I don't want to speak
right.
Yeah,
without knowing
I
the
know.
actual details.
Yeah.
I'll connect you with the right set of folks. But we do have programs for startup,
Okay.
for partners. We have a pretty large team where
Mm-hmm.
you actually get a partner development manager assigned to you. They work. We do joint co-marketing, co-selling. There's a lot of activities that we
That's
do
good.
with the partners also.
Yeah.
Okay, so I share your LinkedIn account with them. So if someone wants to connect with Amit, just please connect on a LinkedIn and you can go from there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
definitely happy to.
We'll be able to,
Or
I
you
think.
can reach out to me. I will share
Yeah, thank
more details about it.
Yeah, yeah. Or give feedback to Nehal, Dhaval, if you have like other ask. I mean, I'm happy to come do. I usually do workshop-oriented things more
you.
than like talking
Oh,
sessions. But so this was fun experience, by the way. Yeah,
We're
yeah,
gonna have a developer summit, so we'll have you over there, as in formal workshop where developers can participate,
yeah,
they
yeah.
can engage with you. So yeah, so our goal was that on one side we were looking to partner with the AWS, but on the other side,
Uh,
startups that we have that are coming with us, we want that startup also to leverage the flexibility of having a native deployment. One of the things that you mentioned in your talk, right, that nowadays it's a trend of having a native first ideology, so they want to also deploy their thing on the AWS, although they might have on Azure. Just like you have apps on, say, Android and
mm.
iOS natively. So here people want to have the native flexibility. So I think it would be great. Yeah, you can share with us the
yeah.
resources, and we'll pass around, and also we'll work on it.
Sure, sure. I will share the deck that I presented. I think we have the emails. I'll
Yeah.
share that to you guys, and we can take further. If you get additional ask, let me know. Thanks to Padma ji who made the
Oh,
connection.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you to Padma. Yeah, she told me lots of about you, and we thought we definitely wants you as a guest in our
Yeah,
event.
we had a lot many people talking about the Azure and the AD, but we had nobody who would talk on the AWS and
Yeah.
Kubernetes. So you were the right person to come in and show us the path.
Okay, cool. By the way, Padma ji is great. So, like, good people actually appreciate more. And thank you. It's been pleasure joining this and presenting. Thanks, Dhaval. Thanks, Nehal, and thanks everyone else who joined. Have a wonderful rest of Friday.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye bye.